So, hi everyone. Welcome to today's talk. Today's talk, the topic of today's talk is called Innate Goodness and the Absolute Manifest. So, I started to talk about this talk a little bit earlier in the introduction to the day of meditation today. And what I'd like to kind of clarify in this talk is what innate goodness is, what it may mean for us, how we access it, and how we experience it. So I'll be talking about the divine abodes, in particular mettā, or warm benevolence. And I'll also be talking about the absolute manifest, which I've mentioned briefly earlier, and I'll give it a little bit more detail during the talk. So I'll be talking from my experience with Theravada Buddhism, but also with Mahayana Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and also from a perspective of, just briefly, a perspective of, I guess it's called Christianity, but, you know, with respect to Jesus and God as we know God, whatever God means for us. So I first made, I first got interested in the angle of innate goodness when I started doing some retreats and sort of exercises with Stephen Snyder, who's a Zen Mahayana practitioner. He also calls himself a Theravadan practitioner. And I just found it very interesting when he was talking about innate goodness, because I'd never really thought about that term. And recently I went on a retreat with Stephen, a 2-week retreat for from the beginning of April till mid-April. And during that retreat, I would have done some sort of innate goodness meditation, every meditation. Sometimes it was just that, and sometimes it was that at the beginning, because it's always good to begin with that type of benevolence or sense of settling in the heart as the beginning of whatever practice you do. It's a way of kind of connecting to that place, I suppose, to that sense. So please understand, but by giving this talk, it's based on my personal experience and also my understandings, which are limited. And I'm not adept in these practices, and I'm continuing to try to understand them, but I'm inviting you to share with my understanding. So I'm inviting you to listen to what I understand so far, what I've discovered along the way. So in essence, accessing one's innate goodness is about recognizing the felt sense or the signs of it within one's heart, and just staying there, as I described in that one of the previous meditations. It's about connecting with that sense of warm benevolence, our innate goodness, and I'll clarify this a bit later, and just dwelling in that, abiding in that. You could say absorbing into that if you wish, like bringing our attention to it, having initial application, sustained application, and then becoming absorbed into it. So it's quite simple. It's a matter of finding the sign of it, what it means for you. And I have it as a felt sense. Some people may have it as a visual thing. Sometimes it's visual for me, but mostly it's a felt sense. And I just stay there. Sometimes it's like having this whole array of experiences, and I just hone in on this particular experience that represents innate goodness for me, and I just stay there. It's quite simple, and the practice is simple. However, it's quite difficult to do, as you may well understand, because often our attention just doesn't stay there. often our concentration wavers, and also there's barriers that get in the road. The barriers such as doubt about whether this is innate goodness or not, or the doubt about our capacity to have anything innately good in ourselves, and all sorts of hindrances come up. And this, in being able to work with it, it's a way of working with those hindrances and letting them go. And when we let go of the hindrances, there it is, if that makes sense. It's like I went on this retreat, I learned about something about concentration, and something that Sayadaw Alpak had said about the difference between, say, concentration-based practices or jhana practices, leading those practices that lead towards jhanas that are focused on developing samadhi, and those practices that lead towards the development of insight. There's differences in them, and I won't go into the differences right now, other than to say the samadhi practices are thought to purify the mind. The insight practices are thought, or the practice of insight, to develop insight, is thought to purify view, which is very interesting. So what we find with this purification of mind is that we attend to something and our mind will go off. And it's this constant bringing it back to attend to a particular object or a particular thing. In that bringing back, we tend to, for want of a better word, purify or clean up or reduce the tendency to follow on with those distracting pathways. When we follow on with distracting pathways, we tend to feed into them and they grow stronger. You can think about this in terms of neural pathways. That which fires together wires together. I mean, that's an example of making a neural pathway stronger. The more we attend to a particular pathway, the stronger that pathway will become. And if that pathway is unwholesome, then the stronger that pathway becomes. That stronger that unwholesomeness or that kilesa. You've heard me talk about kilesa. Kilesa are unwholesome tendencies or patterns or mental distortions. The stronger they become. So what we're doing with concentration is, by bringing our attention back, we're pulling away, feeding into the kilesa. The kilesa, I just mentioned them. Some of you may remember me talking about kilesa. Kilesa refers to mental defilements, basically, mental tendencies that are unwholesome and unhelpful, that lead to further and further suffering. So what we're doing when we're concentrating on something, we're purifying our mind. We're cleaning up our tendencies. And when I did some retreats with Alan Wallace and used to practice with Alan Wallace, he would talk about how samadhi practices lead to accessing substrate consciousness. Now, substrate consciousness is, as far as I understand, is this consciousness that is underneath our personality. It's not the personality consciousness. It's that consciousness that has a continuity through lifetimes. So when we can access substrate consciousness, we can access memories from past life, for example. Whether you believe in that or not, another story. But this is one way we can think about it. What happens with samadhi practices, we go deeply into our states of consciousness, and we access something that we're not normally able to access through superficial concentration or even access concentration. Okay, so one way I understand innate goodness is as a mettā practice. Mettā is one of the four divine abodes. The other divine abodes are compassion, appreciative joy or mudita, and equanimity or upekkha. They are considered boundless. And this particular divine abode is based on, mettā is based on the quality of benevolence. Loving kindness is often called, but probably not the best word. I think benevolence is better. And it's this being able to incline towards happiness. It's the wish for happiness within oneself and others. It is the inclination towards happiness, and it is also being able to see the good in oneself and others, rather than seeing what's wrong all the time. Mettā is the direct antidote to ill will. You know, the hindrance of ill will being that aversion, divisiveness, aggression, the tendency to push away experiences and become aggressive towards experiences. That is ill will. Warm benevolence is the direct opposite. And warm benevolence, like all the divine abodes, in its pure state, is unconditional. It doesn't depend on being approved of. It doesn't depend on being a good person. It doesn't depend on what you do. It is unconditional. And I really like the analogies that Analio has towards these four divine abodes, or these four immeasurables, they're called in Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism. He has these analogies related to the sun and the moon. The sun refers to mettā. The sun at midday in a temperate climate, say in Tasmania today, the shining sun at midday shines down and doesn't discriminate with where it shines. It shines on everything that is available and present for it to receive its shiningness. It's shine, it's sunlight, it's warm radiation. And it's a lovely experience. It's just pervasive, non-discriminating. It is unconditional. The sun doesn't choose where it's going to shine, it just shines on everything. Compassion in these analogies is like the sun at sunset. It's kind of, there's something being lost, something's going, but there's a certain beauty about it at the same time. There's a certain honoring of the day that's gone, and we can have that. There's a tone to it. There's a flavor to it. There's a vibration to compassion that's like a sunset, if you know what I mean. Mudita, or appreciative joy, is like the sun. The rising of the sun in the morning. You know, sunrise. You know how the sun comes out and shines, and there's an energetic. There's an upliftment of energy. It's just so joyous. And, you know, the sun's rays get on the dew on the leaves and they sparkle, and, you know, the birds are singing. So that's how we can understand mudita, this joy, this appreciative joy that arises. And equanimity is compared to a full moon, how it shines on everything. It's pervasive, but it's soft and gentle and not too strong. It's just this peacefulness and all-pervasive illumination of things. So there are many ways we can practice the four divine abodes. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a text called the Visuddhimagga, and it describes a whole range of various practices. And I think they use words, they use concepts, they use all sorts of categories of beings to practice warm benevolence, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. They particularly use their intentions. What is featured in the teachings or the descriptions of the four divine abodes and how you practice them is being able to have the right intention or the right aspiration. It is the aspiration for happiness with loving kindness. It's the aspiration to alleviate suffering with compassion. It's the aspiration, or it's the sharing and the empathy of joy, or it's the appreciation of joy. It's the appreciation of good qualities and virtues with appreciative joy. And it is the sense of peacefulness with equanimity. So I think that's great. I think the Visuddhimagga and those ways of practicing loving kindness and compassion and appreciative joy and equanimity, often using words, is fantastic. However, I incline towards the early Buddhist approach to cultivating these four divine abodes, and that is by seeing them as boundless states of absorption, or seeing them as boundless states. And we're not directing them to anybody, because if you think of boundlessness in Pali, it's called appamana. Boundlessness means that there are no boundaries, like it's infinitely spacious. So this is sense of spaciousness, but at the same time, there's no boundaries between self and other. The boundaries between self and other dissolve. In other words, it's a non-dual experience. And you may have heard of non-duality in a lot of spiritual practices. Non-duality means it's empty, or there is no subject-object bifurcation. In other words, there's no me and you, there's just the experience. So with the Visuddhimagga way, they're often talking about loving kindness and compassion, appreciative joy, and so on, as being dualistic. In other words, I'm giving loving kindness to you. And in compassion-focused therapy, there's three flows of compassion, and that is self to other, other to self, and self to self. With boundlessness, or with when you're practicing the divine abode in a boundless way, the way they would have described it in early Buddhism, it is as if these three directions become redundant, because there's no me or other. There's just the experience of compassion, for example. There's the boundless experience of compassion, the non-dual experience of compassion. So from a dualistic perspective, it's really useful, however, to have this sense of me to you and you to me and myself to myself, because in reality, when we live in dualistic worlds, that's the way we experience these experiences. That's the way we experience love, for example. We experience it as, coming from my partner or my friends or my teachers to me, for example. And then I will have love towards them, and I can also have love towards myself. So it's really useful and it's practical to talk in those terms. And it's also practical and useful to think in those terms, because this is the way we generate and access these qualities. And when I've been practicing mettā for many years, and I think I mentioned earlier, when I first started practicing mettā, I didn't have children. Actually, I've been practicing mettā for as long as I've been associated with Buddhism. And at first I found mettā a little bit difficult. I found compassion really quite easy, because I was suffering a lot, and I could easily see other people suffering, and I could actually rouse compassion quite easily. And I remember it wasn't until I made a really, really good friend, an intimate friend. I met a lovely friend. He's still my friend. And I really got a sense of what it was like to have mettā, this unconditional, warm friendliness towards someone, and feeling that. So it's useful to be able to recognize the experience of being loved, the experiencing of giving love, and the experience of loving oneself, so that they become ways we can rouse these qualities. They become ways we can stimulate them. And sometimes the word that's used is kindle this quality. I don't know what the Pali is for that word, but it is like we'll often have an object to kindle this quality. And once it's kindled, what we can do is then stay with the sign of it. We experience the sign of it, the felt experience of it. So coming at these divine abodes, mettā included here, we might be able to recognize it immediately, and we just go straight to the sign in our hearts. Then we become absorbed in those, and then that experience becomes boundless. We feel expansive. We feel like there's a dissolution of internal and external, a dissolution of our boundaries, and it becomes boundless. And the way we do that is by firstly having a sign of it, firstly having a way we can stimulate the sign with a kindling, then bringing attention or awareness to the felt sense, and then applying initial application, sustained application, feeling the experiences of it, and then letting go into the deep absorption into it, and then letting it just do its own thing. That makes sense. So when I first began doing mettā, as I was mentioning before, I found it difficult. Then when I had children, I found it a lot easier. When I met a good friend and then I had children, it was easy for me to then just think of my friend or my children, and that would trigger a sense of warmth and benevolence in my heart. And then I would focus on the heart. Since I've had grandchildren, the grandchildren are now my kindler, the way I kindle these warm experiences. Something about mettā, again, is that it's not only having the wish for happiness, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to hone in on it now. It is also being able to see the goodness in oneself and others. So when we're talking about innate goodness, it's being able to recognize that goodness, to hone in on it. It could be the same as mettā, and it is. It's the same as this mettā within oneself and directed to oneself. So what's the other thing I wanted to say something about this? There's something about the term innate. And innate, as far as I understand it, means that it's just there. It means that we're kind of born with it. We don't have to develop it, but it's just there. And in this case, when we talk about innate goodness, we're talking about this quality of loving kindness or quality of warm benevolence, this quality of unconditional love that's already there. And when I was listening to a talk by Migyu Rinpoche, and he was talking about, I can't remember if he mentioned the word innate goodness or the fact that warm benevolence is innate. He referred to it as being the wish for happiness, that everyone has the wish for happiness. And that's something that unites humanity and all beings. All beings wish for happiness. And so this wish for happiness, he was saying, is innate. If that makes sense. it's something that's there all the time. We don't have to cultivate it, but we can cultivate it. I'm sorry, I should say that, but it is something that's there. And when we talk about innate goodness, we're talking about something that's already there, that's already recognized. So I mentioned earlier that you don't have to use, grandchildren or children. You can use any object. And I mentioned seeing someone quite beautiful down the baseball park. It was just such a lovely experience. And I was just walking outside in my garden just then, and I looked at a flower, and we've got some really beautiful flowers in my garden at the moment. And that's a sort of a connection with something quite beautiful. I noticed that it sparks in me a kind of an appreciation of innate goodness, believe it or not. I mean, just looking at a flower, seeing something that is quite beautiful, there's a connection to something. So when I first started to practice innate goodness with Stephen Snyder, I was quite curious about what that actually meant. And for me, it began to be a kind of like a koan. A koan is a Zen riddle. It's a question that has no conceptual answer. What is the sound of one hand clapping, for example? Or, who am I? You go off with these koans and you work at trying to find out what the answer is, but you don't really come up with a conceptual answer, but you come up with an insight or an acknowledgement or an understanding. And when I began practicing innate goodness meditation, and I just thought, oh, this is just mettā towards oneself. But I sort of thought, oh, well, maybe there's something a little bit deeper in all this. And I questioned myself. I thought, what is this innate goodness? Where is it? What is it? And it became like a koan for me. And there's a famous koan, what is your original face? There's a famous Zen koan. And for me, it got to a point of, well, what is my innate goodness? Where is it? And it was like going through layers. I could see myself, I'm 67 now. I could see myself at 50 and 40 and 30 and 20 and 7 and, 5 and 6 and right back to, I can't remember when I was born, but, even back to a child. There's something that's innate there. What is it? What is my original face? What is my original innate goodness? And it's kind of a mystery, but it's a mystery that brings up a sense of awe. And if you think about non-duality, sometimes people think about non-duality in a way where there is just the mind, for example. Like I'm looking out here in the trees and I can see there's trees out there and so on. But I also know that that's my projection. That's my mind. There's a non-dual perspective on that. I can see that there's just my subjectivity. However, just because there's non-duality doesn't mean that nobody exists out there. It's just that I know that you guys exist. You guys will be having your own non-dual experience. I know that there's another, and it's a bit of a mystery how all this works. I think a mystery that's beyond my conceptual understanding. The fact that I'm looking at you on the screen, I can see your faces, I can recognize who you are and so on. But I know that that recognition is my projection at the same time. So it's a non-dual experience looking at you. I know that it's just my mind. I also know that if I said something and it hurt you, something hurtful, it would hurt you. If I stood on your toes, for example, it would hurt. And it's not just my non-dual thinking. it's actually hurting somebody. There's actually someone out there. So how do we bring together that understanding of non-duality and the reality of there being something out there, somebody out there, there being another person? And I was thinking about this, and I did a meditation with Stephen Snyder. It was a great meditation. One day I might do it with you guys. It was called Ocean Meditation. And in Ocean Meditation, it begins with having a vision of the ocean as vast and expansive, and kind of like being high up and above it. And then coming down, and Stephen introduces a sunset with different colors, and he asks us to feel into the colors, which is really quite lovely, because you get a sense of a felt sense of it, of color, rather than a conceptual sense of color, which is really lovely. Then you see the ocean. This is in your imagination, but imagination and concepts have a function here. You see the ocean, and then you tune in to the waves on the ocean, and you see all these waves moving across the ocean. Then you tune in on one wave, and that wave is like you. That's your particular mind stream or body mind stream. So you're being with that wave, being who you are, like focusing on yourself and your body, mind, and your experience. And then you expand your experience to realize that you're just part of the greater ocean. And there's other waves out there. So this sense of tuning into our wave and tuning into self and other is like this. It's like being a wave in an ocean, and you're part of the ocean is just part of you. Sorry, you are part of the ocean, and the water in the ocean is kind of shared, but there's distinct waves within the ocean, but it's kind of one big ocean, if that makes sense. This is the way I'm beginning to understand interdependence, the way I'm beginning to understand this mystery of there being a non-dual experience, but also the reality of the other out there, that we're all part of this great fabric, interconnected ocean of experience. And then you can distinguish particular waves in this ocean, but we're all kind of unified and interdependent on each other, if that makes sense. So this is when you inquire into what is innate goodness, all sorts of things can arise, and all sorts of insights can arise and happen. And one can then start to see how innate goodness is also a kind of like a portal to the absolute. So, but just being able to stay with the felt sense of warm benevolence is so powerful. I mentioned earlier about how we, about neuroplasticity and the cultivation of tendencies and so on. William James is a famous humanist psychologist. Oh, was he a humanist psychologist? Famous psychologist, a forefather of modern psychology back at the turn of last century. And he had a lot of really great sayings. And there's one saying, I can't remember the exact words, but it goes something like this: what we attend to becomes our reality. One of you may know the exact words, but I think it's something like that, meaning that what gets our attention gets us. And what we attend to becomes reality for us. So if we attend to, why I made the mistake of doing in the last 6 months, attend to the news and news of Ukraine and news of war and news of weapons development and how, one country is getting, more and more refined and more sophisticated in how they develop, how they can destroy things and kill people and so on. It gets really depressing. It's like that becomes one's reality. one's attending to the misery of the world. And I do this because I don't want to be in denial. I want to be open to what's happening in the world. But I noticed that I have a tendency to get caught up in it. I get a little bit interested in it and get really into it. And it produces a sense of depression. It's like what I attend to becomes my reality. However, if you can have a bit of restraint with that and actually attend to something good, like, for example, when we attend to our innate goodness. And I invited you in the meditations earlier to find the sign of innate goodness in your heart. Something simple. And the way it is, what I found, it's like recognizing happiness in one of the jhana factors. You know, the jhana factors of happiness is kind of lightheartedness, this lightness in your heart. It's like that. When one recognizes something, one's innate warm benevolence, one's loving kindness, one's goodness, it's like, and we stay there, that becomes our reality. Like, it's been described as a lightness of heart, like a spaciousness, a buoyancy. And this is what I've experienced, a buoyancy, a kind of carefreeness, a sense that we're okay and that everything's okay, which is really, really lovely. So the more we do that, the more everything that is opposite to that fades away. It doesn't mean the wars go away, and it doesn't mean that there's horrible things happening. The horrible things still happen, but there's a different perspective on it. We come at it from a different perspective. It's a perspective of openness and kindness and connection. So, oh yeah, when I was on this 2-week retreat, one day I was practicing opening my heart to love. And it actually felt like I was being lifted by a cloud of love. It was really far out. You know, it's just this, it was kind of like, it was quite, there was a visual component to it, but it was also a felt sense component. It was like this cloud of love that was all around me. And this love, one time I had a vision about 5 or 6 years ago on a retreat where I had a pool. There was this pool of love. It was a pool of receptivity. I didn't think of it as love, but I just thought of it, of this receptivity and openness. And it was a vision that came to me. And I remember touching it, like imagining I touched it. And it was like, you know that image of in the, what's it called? That movie, The Matrix, you know, where Neo touches the mirror and it kind of dissolves into it. You remember that image? For me, this vision was like that. I kind of touched it and I sort of dissolved into it. And what I was dissolving into was this complete receptivity of acceptance, a complete transformation, if that makes sense. And since then, I've managed to bring that image up sometimes. And if I'm ever having suffering, I just kind of put my suffering into it and it completely transforms it. So, and I remember doing doing Tonglen 40 years ago with Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe, and I was a bit afraid of it. Tonglen is this practice of breathing in terrible stuff and dissolving it and breathing out loving kindness. It's a bit more than that, but that's just a simple example of it. And I relearned this meditation with Alan Wallace, and he presented it in such a different way that we became really useful and helpful. The way Alan presented it was to breathe, to develop this heart of the Buddha, within your heart, like a light, and then let it dissolve all your suffering, like breathe in all your allow the suffering that you have to go into it and be transformed by it. So over the years, I've practiced that, and it's been very helpful because I can, whenever I have suffering, I can sort of just let it be transformed in the light of the Buddha's heart. And when I work with clients, people who are suffering, sometimes I don't breathe in their suffering like it's traditionally taught, but I kind of allow that suffering to come into the Buddha's heart and be transformed. I kind of imagine that's happening. And I think that imagination has some effect on the person I'm with, because they seem to be able to let go of their whatever they're suffering about. So I've done that practice for a number of years. And on this retreat, I was doing it in a different way. Rather than a pool in front of me or a pool in my heart, it's like this light of this complete receptivity was all pervasive. And just, I was dissolving into it. And there was a vision. There was another vision here of me falling back, like in those old trust exercises, you know, of the 70s and 80s, for those who are old enough to remember those days. You know, we used to go on experiential workshops, you know, Gestalt therapy workshops and bioenergetics workshops and all sorts of different workshops. And you do these trust exercises where you just fall back into the arms of someone who's behind you, which have a wonderful potential and for healing and feeling trust. However, they're very dangerous if people don't catch you. But anyway, I had this vision of being in that trust exercise and just falling back and remembering the love that everyone had. And then what was interesting was that I became one of those people catching. When we rouse warm benevolence or innate goodness, when we access it, we use all sorts of kindlers. And I was mentioning earlier, the way we can kindle it is having a memory of being loved, of loving, and also loving ourselves. And sometimes I think of how much love there is in the world and all the people that have been very kind to me and very benevolent and compassionate. And that's enough for me to kind of melt into this ocean of love. And sometimes I think of how much I've been kind to people. You know, in my job, I spend days, you know, sometimes I just sit there and I'm compassionate. And I think you professionals in the health field will know what I'm talking about. It's just, there's so much suffering out there. We embody compassion to somehow hold that. So in this exercise, what I know, sorry, not in the exercise, but in this experience, I noticed that there I was catching myself. All the kindness that I have, towards other people, I was directing it towards myself. So I'm just wanting to share that experience because it's indicative of how we can connect with this innate goodness, which is, if you want to look at it from a non-dual sense, it's not our innate goodness or someone else's innate goodness. It's just innate goodness. It's just warm benevolence. So coming to this sense of how it can be a portal to the unmanifest, the unconditioned, and how it may represent the unmanifest, the absolute unmanifest. A couple of months ago, I gave a talk on awakening, and I mentioned there were 3 developments in Buddhism. And I explained it these developments were explained by Venerable Gyaltsen on a retreat that I did with him on emptiness. It was a weekend online retreat with Analio and Venerable Gyaltsen, who is a Chan master, Chan meditation master. And he teaches silent illumination, which is one of the meditation practices. So he talked about 3 developments in Buddhism. And the first development was with early Buddhism, where it was the path, he called it the path of abandonment, where what we do is we let go of the causes of suffering. And the practice is directed at letting go of craving, because craving is the cause of suffering. So the practice is at letting go of craving. And I've been practicing that for many years. That's, it's my core practice. And that's the path of abandonment. Another path of practice he called the path of transformation. And this is where we energetically embrace the parts of ourselves we struggle with and we transform them. We transform them to liberation. We use that energy to transform it. And these practices can be found in Tibetan Mahayana and Vajrayana practices, such as Tantra, or where we become one with enlightened beings or enlightened qualities. And Vajrayana practices, it's really great, some very great practices. I still do some of these where I imagine that white Tara is in front of me. White Tara, emanation of compassion, and I experience the compassion coming from her. And I see the warm compassion in her eyes, and she's just completely compassionate. Sometimes when I've been suffering enormously, I just bring to mind white Tara, and it's like she comes into me, and I feel all the compassion, I feel it healing, and then I imagine she comes into me and into my heart, and then I become white Tara. That's this practice, part of this practice, one way you could describe it. And from that place, I then emanate and radiate kindness and compassion. The next path is called, the next development in Buddhism, Venerable Gyalgo called the path of recognition. And this is very much to do with the way, the perspectives that the different developments in Buddhism take. Like the perspective of Theravadan Buddhism or early Buddhist stuff, early Buddhist practices, is very much about cultivation. Cultivation, and the term for meditation in Pali is bhavana, where bhavana means to bring into being. So we're cultivating something. We're letting go of the unwholesome and we're cultivating the wholesome. And in Mahayana Buddhism, however, it's a little bit different. It's like the term for meditation in Tibetan, I think, is gom. And gom means to become familiar with something. What we do is become familiar with what is unwholesome, but also we become familiar with the wholesome. And it's not a part of, it's not a way of cultivating something, but recognizing something, pulling aside the veils of delusion to see what is already there and has always been there, our Buddha nature, the absolute. So this third area of this third development, this path of recognition, is included in practices such as Mahamudra of Tibetan Buddhism and silent illumination of Chan Buddhism and Shikantaza of Japanese Zen Buddhism, and also in signless samadhi. And some of you have practiced this with me. Signless samadhi is from the Shorter Discourse on Emptiness. It's about having samadhi without a sign, without an object. And it's about being present for experience directly, just like they do in these other practices with Shikantaza and silent illumination. One is present and one sees beyond the appearance of things. One sees, one has insight into ultimately the unconditioned, nibbana. Sana samadhi doesn't necessarily focus on, it's not necessarily, if you're practicing sana samadhi, you're not necessarily practicing nibbana, whether you can say that's a practice or not, but it's certainly one of the closest practices that one could have towards experiencing nibbana that I think of. Anyway, so this third path of recognition is about seeing what is already here, seeing past the defilements, seeing past the things that get in the road, putting aside the hindrances, putting aside everything, and seeing directly. Studying with Stephen Snyder, in Demystifying Awakening, which is the book he's written. Here's that book. The book there. I'm giving you a promo. He says that awakening needs three components. This is his opinion. One, a deep experience of absence of self or emptiness, not self or emptiness. Two, the recognition of one's true nature as one's true identity. It's interesting. It's the recognition with, in Theravada Buddhism, we're aiming towards Nibbana, the experience of Nibbana, or if you can call it an experience, the insight into the realization of Nibbana. That's probably the best way of describing it. And often the way that's explained, or the way that's talked about in other practices, in the Mahayana practices, is more like awakening to our Buddha nature. Okay, so our Buddha nature becomes our true identity, rather than these conditioned mind-body things like our personality and so on. That becomes our true nature. And the third component that Stephen Snyder talks about is a thorough unity experience where all is one and everything is in the fabric of oneness or interconnectedness. So he talks about how in Zen practices, the first two are emphasized, like the emptiness and the recognition of one's true nature. That's emphasized. However, he says that that third component, that sense of recognizing our interconnectedness, that unity of being with others, or our common humanity, it's not recognized. And in fact, he was saying that some Zen meditation teachers are quite brutal. And I remember listening to Analia give a talk. It was a great talk. And I think he says this several times on numbers of talks, but he says something like, compassion without emptiness is exhausting. Whereas emptiness without compassion is toxic. So what he means by that is that if we just focus on this experience of emptiness without a sense of connection to the other, then it can actually become toxic. Like I was explaining before, I could come and step on your foot and say, oh, it's just my mind. So nobody's hurting here. Suffering's just in your mind, and I'm not hurting. But it's the reality that when I step on your foot, it hurts for you, if that makes sense. So Analio, what I'm hearing from Analio is he's saying that we need to connect with these, that sense of connection with other beings. And he would describe it as through the four divine abodes, for example, as a way of not becoming toxic in our relationship to emptiness. So look, I hope I'm not going too long. I hope you're still staying connected. I've still got about a little bit that I want to say. I hope that's all right with you. I'm trying not to go over an hour, but I might just go over an hour. I was talking before about the mystery of non-duality, and the fact that there are actually people out there, or there are actually beings out there. I think that mystery is resolved when we can connect with innate goodness, when we connect with this sense of connection, connect with the sense of connection. That's a bit of a double fold. But when we can connect with common humanity, when we can connect with common humanity via, say, the four divine abodes, then it's a resolution for that mystery. We are just like one wave in an ocean where we're connected through the ocean. Just want to mention something extra. And this is where I bring in a bit about Christianity. And when I was about 3 or 4 years old, we were living in Sydney, and we had a very long house, and it was a very dark, narrow pathway, down hallway. And I remember feeling scared to go down the pathway, going down that hallway, because I remember literally seeing gremlins coming out of the floorboards in a nightmare, but also I really saw them. I really saw these gremlins coming out, and I was afraid of them. And I went out to my mum and I said, "Oh, Mum, I'm really scared about going down the hallway. Can you come with me?" And she could have come with me, but she'd said, "Who's always with you? Who's always with you?" And I said, "Oh, God." And she said, "Yes, God's always with you." And actually, it's actually consoling. And I managed to walk down that hallway without too much fear. And I just remember it. I remember this sense of connection with something greater than myself. I remember a sense of something out there, a kind of presence. And then in high school, I managed to get out of scripture. My mother wrote me a letter saying I didn't have to go to scripture. So I didn't get much into Christianity or anything. And then I eventually moved to Melbourne. I was studying in art college there. And that's where I got introduced to Buddhism. And around about the same time, I got involved with a spiritual church, a liberal Catholic church, that were doing hands-on healing on a Saturday, and they have these really great services on a Sunday. And it was so cool. It was just so amazing. And I remember walking into the churches and actually feeling something, Fortunately, I had my association with Catholicism in a positive way. It was a liberal Catholic church. It was really wonderful. We do hands-on healing, and we'd be doing, working with the chakras and working with the auras and all sorts of things. It was really wonderful. I remember walking into that church and getting some sort of, I don't know what it was. I think it was communion or something like that. It really felt powerful. I could feel the angels. I could feel this presence. And maybe I was psychotic, but, it really felt true for me. It felt like something was there. And there was a kind of a benevolence around me. And later I went to Thailand, and I was a monk for a couple of years, or almost 2 years. And I did some pretty intense practices, and I had some pretty interesting experiences. I won't go into details about that now. But there was a sense after some of these experiences, and around this time, there was a definite sense of a benevolent presence. Something was there. I could say, oh, they're just devas, but it was more than that. It was something beyond this body-mind. And it was benevolent. It was love. It was really feeling like that. And I know I've read a little bit about Christian mysticism, and they use terms like ineffable, like unexplainable, non-conceptual. They also talk about this palpable love and acceptance, unconditional. So when I talk about that luminous pool, and that sense that the luminous pool dissolves and it becomes this palpable love around, it is a way of surrendering and letting go of our suffering. letting go of all that causes our suffering. It becomes a possibility for us to release our dukkha. And in that way, accessing innate goodness and accessing this, the absolute manifest as love, is a portal. It can be a portal, in my view, to the unmanifest, to nibbana, to the experience of the absolute. So when we can access the absolute, both manifest and unmanifest, by being present, and that's how we do it. We're completely present. We see through the creations of the world, we see through our conceptual creations, and we sit back, open up to it, and are receptive to it rather than trying to get into it. And it happens now, the only time there is. And this moves us beyond our conceptual projections of the world and reality, and sees through the creations, and helps us let go of this stuff and eventually find the unconditioned, discover the unconditioned, realize the unconditioned. And we live it through, love, I suppose. So when we can open to the benevolence and compassion that is present and pervasive within and without, it allows us to surrender the hindrances and the identities and let go of our suffering. So thank you very much for listening, and may we all wake up to the emptiness of boundless, unconditioned benevolence, our innate goodness. Thank you very much. So let's have a few moments silence.